Welcome to another explainer. Today we're taking some incredibly complex research and breaking it down so you can truly understand what's happening right now inside your own body. We are going on a fascinating journey into the hidden biology of body fat. For the longest time, the medical consensus basically viewed fat as this inert energy storage depot, right? Just a passive warehouse for extra calories. But modern science has completely rewritten that narrative. Today, we're looking at the origin story of a biological villain that is quite literally hiding in plain sight. So, I want to kick things off with a pretty provocative question. Why is a pound of belly fat exponentially more dangerous than a pound of thigh fat? Think about that for a second. We've been taught for decades to think of fat as just, well, fat. But the reality? All body fat is definitely not created equal. Depending on exactly where it lives and how it grows, it can either be a physiological lifesaver or a highly toxic driver of disease. To answer that question, here's our roadmap for this explainer. First, a tale of two fats. Second, the hypertrophy breaking point. Third, the macrophage immune switch. Fourth, the portal vein superhighway. And finally, number 5, systemic fallout and disease. We're going to take a structured, step-by-step journey through your body's cellular landscape.
Okay, Section 1. A tale of two fats, subcutaneous versus visceral adipose tissue. Let's establish exactly where our fat actually lives to understand why belly fat is such a unique threat.
Our bodies essentially have two primary storage depots. First up is subcutaneous adipose tissue, or SAT. This is the fat directly beneath your skin, like what you'd find in your thighs or glutes. Now, when SAT needs to store more energy, it primarily expands through a process called hyperplasia. That basically means it creates brand new, perfectly healthy fat cells. It's kind of like safely adding more luggage into the massive cargo hold of an airplane. But then, we have visceral adipose tissue, or VAT. This is the hazardous fat packed deep within your abdominal cavity, literally wrapping around your internal organs. And here's the kicker. VAT has a very limited ability to create new cells. So to store more energy, it has to swell its existing cells to absolutely massive proportions. That process is called hypertrophy. Imagine trying to overstuff a single suitcase until the zipper is screaming and about to burst open. That's visceral fat. So subcutaneous fat is essentially the good guy in this story. It acts as a physiological buffer, a metabolic sink that safely stores your extra lipids. Plus, it drains completely harmlessly into your systemic circulation via the inferior vena cava, which is one of your body's main veins. Visceral fat, on the other hand, is fundamentally limited. It is incredibly dense with immune cells and blood vessels. And because it just lacks the capacity to differentiate new pre-adipocytes, it is highly sensitive to that dangerous hypertrophy, especially when it's exposed to saturated fats.
Which brings us to Section 2, the hypertrophy breaking point. When the cellular suitcase bursts. What actually happens when that single cellular suitcase can't hold a single drop more?
This introduces a crucial concept, adipocyte hypertrophy. Under caloric overload, those visceral fat cells swell to a point where they actually become pathological. As the fat cell gets larger and larger, it eventually exceeds its physiological diffusion limit. It literally starts to choke because it can no longer get enough oxygen. This is a state known as cellular hypoxia. The internal mechanical stress builds up, and eventually the cell undergoes apoptosis. It just dies.
Now, the really crucial point here is that this cell death, it isn't some quiet, peaceful process. It's a catastrophic rupture. And the research highlights that certain saturated fatty acids, specifically palmitic acid, uniquely accelerate this toxic swelling in visceral fat. They cause those fat cells to burst way faster than they normally would. And when they burst, they violently spill their toxic contents all over the place, sounding a massive biological alarm right inside your abdomen.
Moving to Section 3, the macrophage immune switch, from peacekeepers to attackers. What's truly fascinating is how your immune system responds to that biological alarm. This is exactly where our story takes a dark turn. Before we go any further, we need to meet the main characters of your immune system's cleanup crew, the macrophages. These are highly specialized white blood cells whose entire job is to engulf and digest cellular debris. In healthy adipose tissue, they are your key regulators. They keep things clean and maintain metabolic homeostasis. But here's the wild part. Macrophages actually have split personalities. Just look at the stark contrast between these two states. In a healthy, lean state, your fat tissue is dominated by M2 macrophages. Think of these guys as the peacekeepers, or the gardeners. They use oxidative metabolism, they secrete anti-inflammatory cytokines like IL-10, and they actively promote insulin sensitivity. But when they're suddenly exposed to the toxic debris of those bursting fat cells we just talked about, they undergo a drastic immunological shift. They polarize into M1 macrophages, The attackers. They completely switch up their metabolism to aerobic glycolysis. They pump out aggressive, pro-inflammatory cytokines like TNF-alpha and IL-6, and they literally block insulin signaling in the surrounding tissues. The underlying mechanics of how this switch flips are just incredible. When those visceral fat cells choke and die, all that cellular debris physically binds to specific receptors on your macrophages, specifically TLR4. Now combine that binding with the low oxygen, hypoxic zones deep inside that swollen fat, and this toxic microenvironment violently flips the switch. The peacekeepers are forced to become attackers, and they immediately start secreting cytokines that trigger local insulin resistance right there in your belly.
To really give you a sense of the scale of this microscopic battle, consider this staggering number: 40%. In obese adipose tissue, these aggressive, attacking macrophages can make up a massive 40% of all the cells in that tissue. That's up from just 10% in lean tissue. Your belly fat effectively transforms into a massive, heavily inflamed battleground.
Section 4. The portal vein superhighway, a direct line to liver toxicity. Let's zoom out to the anatomy and see how this localized cellular warfare becomes a systemic disaster for your entire body.
Remember earlier how we established that subcutaneous fat safely drains into your general circulation? Well, visceral fat does not. Because of its specific anatomical location, when visceral fat breaks down and releases all those highly toxic free fatty acids and pro-inflammatory cytokines, they drain directly into the portal vein. And the portal vein is a superhighway that leads straight to your liver. This means your poor liver gets absolutely flooded with massive, highly concentrated doses of these toxins long before they can be diluted by the rest of your bloodstream. The immediate result? Your liver's insulin receptors are essentially blinded. Receptor binding drops by a whopping 50%, which leads directly to high blood sugar and hepatic steatosis.
In the research world, this is famously known as the portal hypothesis. Because visceral adipose tissue entirely bypasses normal systemic circulation, it acts as a localized, high-pressure source of hepatic toxicity. Honestly, if you took this exact same fat and just moved it just beneath the skin, it wouldn't have this severe, immediate toxic effect on the liver. It is completely about the location and the internal plumbing.
Which brings us to our final section, number 5, systemic fallout and disease, atherosclerosis and cancer. Because once your liver fails to process this toxic flood, the systemic fallout begins.
This kicks off an aggressive atherogenic domino effect. It turns out when the liver is overloaded with those free fatty acids from your visceral fat, it starts frantically packaging them into VLDL particles. Through a complex lipid exchange process happening right in your blood, these particles actively destroy your HDL, which is your good cholesterol, and they shrink your LDL into highly dangerous small, dense LDL, or SDLDL. These SDLDL particles are uniquely terrifying because they're small enough to easily penetrate the walls of your arteries, getting trapped and creating atherosclerotic plaques. And it doesn't stop there. Because your body is now resistant to insulin, your pancreas is forced to pump out massive amounts of it. This state of chronic hyperinsulinemia acts as a powerful systemic growth factor that fuels cells' survival and division across your entire body.
Which leads us directly to this very heavy statistic, 1.48. Based on massive epidemiological data, like from the UK Biobank study, 1.48 is the exact hazard ratio for obesity-related cancers when abdominal obesity is paired with physical inactivity. Belly fat isn't just a cardiovascular risk, folks. It is a severe oncogenic risk.
And the scientific literature is crystal clear on why this happens. Visceral adiposity drives what's known as the systemic insulin IGF-1 axis. Basically, all that extra insulin constantly floating around acts as a powerful endocrine signal that literally alters the tumor microenvironment. It promotes tumor angiogenesis, which is the creation of new blood vessels specifically to feed tumors, and it accelerates cancer development. The systemic fallout is absolute.
So bringing this all together, this is the fundamental mental model shift you need to walk away with today. Belly fat is not just an inert energy storage depot. Far from it. It is a highly active, toxic, and dangerous endocrine organ. It secretes hormones, it wages localized immune warfare, and it hijacks your liver's metabolic pathways.
Which leaves us with this final critical thought. Now that you understand the true cellular origins of visceral fat's toxic behavior, now that you know exactly how the cellular suitcase bursts and how the portal vein literally floods your liver, what specific lifestyle switches can you make to protect your metabolic health today? Whether it's reducing your saturated fat intake to prevent that cellular hypertrophy or increasing physical activity to improve your insulin sensitivity, the power is entirely in your hands to diffuse this biological alarm. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. Keep learning, stay focused, and I will see you in the next one.